I'm honored to have been asked to moderate this session based on the world premiere, can you hear me in the back, last night of Mohammed Fairouz's moving Symphony No. 3 entitled Poems and Prayers. As the title and the performance showed us, the symphony inhabits and shuttles between the musical and the verbal, trace and sign. We sometimes say that in globalization we are in an ocean of traces and an island of languaging. To an extent, that was to me very moving. It is therefore appropriate that today's panel is called Music, Literature and Comparative Composition, the Task of Translation. The relationship between music and literature has been one of the strongest areas of comparativist inquiry since the establishment of the discipline. But Fairouz's bold symphony diversifies the verbal field to analogize unity on the model of the metaphor in the phrase family of languages. He taps Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, older material in Hebrew, contemporary material in Arabic and Hebrew, contained within a Jewish rite. The question of translation now proliferates and enters the space of education. Who is the implied listener? Who intends the effect of the work of art? How do we account for the future anterior, something that will have happened in spite of the work of art? What is it to say that thought weighs nothing? Looking forward, as Derrida said 45 years ago. What happens to your grandfather's picture when it hangs in a museum or a ritual iterated on stage? A question I put to Jean-Martin Hubert in 1985 when in his path-breaking show, Magicien de la Terre, a Navajo ritual was iterated on the museum floor at Beaubourg. And I mean that word iteration, because I'm really much more into iteration between music and literature than translation. All are questions also of translation, and our panel is eminently suited to approach these questions. I have been teaching Jacqueline Rose for many years now. Now I'm just following the order here. As I wrote on the cover of the Jacqueline Rose reader, she's a friend and ally. She achieves what many of us attempt, to preserve the delicacy of a training in literary reading in the tough realities of the political. She made psychoanalysis possible for a whole generation of literary critics and activists. And the book that I was blurbing gave her range: analysis, text, war, from South Africa to Palestine. And this is why this dialogue is possible. I move on now. Well, she's professor of English, I wrote down, at Queen Mary College, London University. That was a joke, man. I move on now to my new friends. Michael P. Steinberg, music critic, musicologist and author, at Brown University, director of the Kogut Center for the Humanities and professor of history and music. Associate editor of the Musical Quarterly and the Opera Quarterly. Among his many prizes, I see that he won a Guggenheim in 2003-2004. That's so I mention it. Next is Sinan Antoon, whom I didn't know but I knew of before. Iraqi poet, novelist, scholar and translator, specialist in pre-modern Arabo-Islamic culture and contemporary Arab culture and politics, assistant professor at NYU. I was almost reading my own description. The performers yesterday took my breath away. I cannot mention them here. You're eager for the real discussion to begin. I will, however, mention the conductor, Yoon-jae Lee, translator par excellence, intention on loan, conducting forward and back. In French, the conductor, Johan Ripper, just told me, because I'm a translator from the French, but there was no reason for me to know this, is always chef d'orchestre. I want to mistranslate Roland Barthes here in praise of our conductor and the figure of the conductor in general. In Essed, Barthes suggests that the classical author is born as a performer at the moment he manifests his power of conducting sense. L'auteur classique naît comme performateur à partir du moment où il manifeste son pouvoir de conduire le sens. Mot précisément, writes Bach, ambigu, sémantique et directionnel. I want the conductor here not to be a driver, conduire, but the conductor in a musical performance, mistranslation. Bach's invocation of the ambiguity of the word creates space for constructive mistranslation. Meditating upon the author as conductor, I thought, precisely on January 5, and I continue to think this, that the composition for the conductor is someone else's. The players are also different from the person who conducts the performance. There is a tremendous responsibility here to players present and virtual, audiences present and virtual, to all of us. I have been thinking since January 5, I want to see if I can perform meaning on this model. And I want to close, therefore, with the figure of the conductor, and I want to test ourselves out to see if that's how we are talking about translation and iteration. Each of you will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and we will then invite Mohammed Fairouz to join in a conversation with us and the audience. You see there is a microphone in the middle, and so do please walk up to the mic if you want to ask a question or make a comment. And when you ask a question, keep them brief rather than long perorations, and then do you agree or not? Think about the other people. Mohammed Fairouz introduced himself to us again last night, a brilliant composer, deeply concerned about social justice, played at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, all over the US, Europe, West Asia, Australia, lecturer, teacher. What else should I say, Mohammed? Let the revels begin. Please welcome our panel. Jacqueline? Sorry. Carry on.
Well, thank you for coming, and I just want to start by saying how really thrilled I am to be here. I was part of a discussion with Mohammed Fairouz and Gayatri Spivak about 18 months ago. It was September 2010, and the extraordinary two soloists from his double concerto States of Fantasy. And for me, this is very much the beginning or another stage in what I feel to be a very fruitful dialogue between myself and Mohammed in person, but also between myself and my attempt to understand or move with his music. I had prepared something to say today, but after listening to the Third Symphony last night, I'm going to slightly divert from it, and I have no idea whether I'm going to get back to where I was meant to be. Can I just ask how many people were there yesterday evening? Okay. Well, then you're all of you who were there, and that's most of you, are no doubt reeling from what was, I thought, an absolutely unique and hugely significant musical experience. It seemed to me that what Mohammed had produced was a musical disquisition or exploration on the possibility and risks of death in and as a collective reality. While I was sitting there, a famous phrase of Edward Said, who needs no introduction here, was running through my head when he said in his 1997 essay, Bases for Coexistence, he said, "There is suffering and injustice enough for everybody." And that quotation, those lines have always stayed with me, because on the one hand, they're so simple. Who would take issue with that? On the other hand, we do know that in the competing and clashing narratives over the Middle East, which Mohammed refers to as a crisis that is permanently on the edge of itself, the question of death and suffering and who owns it and to whom it belongs is a very, very profound and difficult and troubled one. And I thought if nothing else, and there was much else, I thought the performance last night produced it a musical riposte to those false forms of proprietorship in relationship to death. So suffering and injustice enough for everybody, if only that was a recognized statement. One of the things that Mohammed said in his introduction, when he asked whether we could listen out for, well, those weren't quite his words, but this was his expression, bombastic nationalism. I think you did say bombastic nationalism, and that just immediately made me realize or think of nationalism as sound, or to put another way, that nationalism is sound. It is a form of auditory rhetoric, and therefore it is so obvious, if you think about it, that the reply to the bombast of nationalism should be another kind of sound. And I felt that is what we had yesterday evening. And I suppose what I would like to say is that the question raised by the piece last night is what kind of collective do we want, or what kind of collective are we talking about? And there were certain moments in the piece that really struck me. And the Ose Shalom, which is the refrain that occurs over and over and again throughout the piece, there's a moment after the performance of the Fadwa Tuqan poem where Mohammed says in his program notes that the woman's chorus, or the woman's choir, comes in at this point without much rhetoric, which is to say that I felt the music was drawing our attention at that point. The tension between the poetry, the music, and the voice of the chorus was drawing our attention to the gap between the experience of death and the possibility of its articulation as part of a political landscape. And the idea that there could be a performance that is so poignant but without much rhetoric seemed to be really to sort of push the boundaries of the forms of combination of speech that are amenable and accessible to us. Can you have lament without reproach or pathos? Can you have a public utterance without rhetoric? And I also was very struck that at moments where the music seemed to enter into its own decline, I say it sort of held off from itself and descended, it was as if we were being given a kind of moment of disillusionment that was not allowed to become a moment of pathos. So throughout the symphony, I felt we were being tantalized, although that's not quite the right word, with certain kind of affective conditions that it was inviting us towards and then taking away from us at the same time. Behind that question of what kind of collective do we want, or what are we talking about, is the question of what kind of dialogue is possible. And I think in one of your interviews, Mohammed, about this piece, you talk about the fact that you talk about this poetry, this music, these prayers. Isn't it poignant that I'm writing a piece calling for them to stop tearing themselves apart? That was how you described the Third Symphony quite a long time ago. I'm creating a piece that is calling for them to stop tearing themselves apart, which means you're calling for another kind of connectivity, another kind of dialogue. And on the way over on the plane, I came from England yesterday. This is going to sound so pretentious. It's not the kind of thing you're meant to do on a plane, so please forgive me. But I was listening to, as one does, of course, Opus 47 by Steinberg, for violin and piano, which had been burnt onto my, I think that's what you call it, burnt onto my iPod, which isn't even mine because I don't have one, by my daughter. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to listen to it. And it seems to me that this piece of music is terribly important for Mohammed. He'll tell me if I'm wrong, not just because it has fantasy in the title, but because of the relationship between the violin and the piano. And I was fortunate enough to be listening to it, played by Gould and Menuhin. So you can imagine, it's absolutely incredible. Because they are such tense and fraught performers, it really forced onto the agenda for me what is the form of connection between these two instruments, and what does it mean to suggest that it's a dialogue? Because it seemed to me that if it was a dialogue, they were also outpacing, tracking, following, usurping, and ignoring each other, which is to say that the idea they were in any sense accompanying each other would be nonsense, but the idea that they were simply in disharmony with each other would also be completely wrong. So I just felt there was something about relatedness going on in that performance, which is very, very important for what Mohammed is doing in his music. It actually made me think, and this is going to sound a bit crazy, it made me think of sibling rivalry, or the relationship between siblings. And I think the reason why it made me think of that is because a few weeks ago I was very lucky to be at an absolutely extraordinary talk by Juliet Mitchell, the psychoanalytic theorist, on the relationship between siblings and war. And she was talking about the law of the mother. Everyone knows about the law of the father. She was talking about the law of the mother. And she was saying the law of the mother is to stop the siblings from killing each other. And the idea of illegitimate violence then spawns as the opposite legitimate violence, which is at the heart of war. And that therefore explains why whenever you have legitimate state-sanctioned violence, you always have illegitimate violence at the same time, killing of civilians, rape, and so on, and looting. So it was a very, very interesting paper. I mean, I haven't hardly done it justice in 2 sentences. Very interesting paper about the relationship between intimacy and violence, if you like, in relationship to cooperation and hatred. And it seems to me that's something of what was conveyed yesterday, where there was a coming together of the 3 languages and a falling apart, and a coming together and a falling apart musically, which I thought was very, very profound. I think to understand, if that's the right word, the Third Symphony, you really do have to listen. It's a plug, Mohammed. You have to listen to his extraordinary CD, specifically one piece on it called Lamentation and Satire, which I find profoundly moving and effective and thought-provoking, in which the question, well, it's there in the title, what is the relationship between lamentation and satire, which could be seen as to be 2 extremes, right, of affective and public emotion. But in fact, in this piece of music, they follow on from each other, they punctuate each other, they're connected to each other. And when he's talking about it in the notes, he talks about vicious unison between voices that have up to then been at least partly separate. So again, I feel what's at stake here is how we can bring together things which absolutely cannot tolerate each other, and how we produce a musical equivalent for that. Okay, just to really add to the potential, as I was listening to Mohammed in the plane, I was also reading, as one does, the wonderful Syrian poet Adonis on Arab poetics. So this was really an amazing trip, as you can imagine. On the way back, I promised to watch some terrible movie just to compensate for myself. And he was talking about the 8th century poet, or the bit of the book that really struck me was about the 8th century poet, Abu Niwas, who, for Adonis, is the origins of a form of modernism which has actually been lost to modern Arab day poetry for reasons which I won't go into. But he's particularly interested in his use of metaphor as a form of dissonant harmony. And he's also particularly interested in tracing Arabic poetry back to pre-Islamic poetry, where it was precisely song. Okay, so the question of harmony and dissonance in the writing of Abu Niwas becomes a question of harmony, and it becomes a question of singing as part of collective ritual to make the collective be able to recognize itself. Now, if you heard the piece last night, I think one of the most, for me, extraordinary things about it is that the idea of a piece of music in which the collective can recognize itself is at once a creative possibility and a danger. And it manages, I think, to convey both those things at once. So the other thing that really struck me when I was listening to it was the extraordinary writing of an Israeli historian, which I don't know if any of you have heard of, but I hear that Michael has even been in dialogue with her. This is Edith Zatal, who's written an incredible book whose Hebrew title is Death and the Nation, which is about how Israel has dealt with the Holocaust in its popular imagination. Much more complex than you might think. And at the end of her book, she says, because of the collectivization of national memory in relationship to that trauma, the work of mourning has not even begun, right? So she's making a distinction between grief as public process and grief as personalized pain, which then becomes a form of accountability. So I also felt that your piece last night was really, by putting Darwish and Turkwan and Amichai into that kind of dialogue with each other, was really trying to force a kind of consciousness about how we commemorate, just very simply, how we commemorate the dead. And I think in another of your interviews, you talk about the fact that Independence Day in Israel, which commemorates 1948, which of course is Nakba, or the catastrophe for the Palestinians, and the Memorial for the War Dead Day are back to back and pretty close to the Holocaust Memorial Day. What you didn't say, Mohammed, although I'm sure you know this, is that the Holocaust Remembrance Day is situated on the Israeli calendar as close as possible, as allowed by the Jewish holiday calendar, to the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's called the Day of Disaster and Heroism. And I think that is incredibly expressive of the idea that death cannot pass into the collective imagination without an uplifting, okay, without an identification of the Jewish people as redeemed by their own suffering, And interestingly, in 1977, Menachem Begin, he wanted to move it. He felt that was inappropriate. He went to the Knesset, he said, we must move it as close as possible to the day of the destruction of the Second Temple. And he was defeated. He was prime minister at the time. He was defeated. The idea that this catastrophe or disaster, I don't want to use the word catastrophe, sorry, disaster of Jewish history should be severed from its relationship to heroism was seen to be unacceptable by the Knesset. And I think that says a lot about the problem that Edith Zertal is talking about. Gayatri, how much more time have I got?
6 minutes.
I've got 6 minutes.
Yep.
Okay, okay. All right. The other thing I wanted to talk about, although I won't do this at any great length, is the concept of freedom in relationship to the music we heard yesterday. And I was very struck when Mohammed was introducing the piece and he was talking about the line about happiness. There is some kind of happiness in all of this. What is it?
Behind all this, some great happiness is hiding.
Is hiding. And you said this was purely ironic, right? Behind all this, some great happiness is hiding. And I just wondered, I think you're right, obviously it's ironic, but I was sort of wondering whether Amichai wasn't also suggesting that behind all this some happiness is potentially hiding if the collective mind can take cognizance of what it's doing to the question of death in public and national life. That's to say, there is a potential happiness that is hiding in there. And the reason why I want to think that's what he's saying is because I want to think what you're also trying to do in your music is produce a contrapuntal, to use Edward Said's famous expression, a contrapuntal form of relatedness which will have the kind of open-ended creativity that Adorno reads in Schoenberg, and it's why he doesn't like Webern and he likes Schoenberg, a kind of open-endedness. And there are just a couple of quotes from Adorno on freedom, which again, your work really resonates with me. And this is the first one. He said, freedom should organize itself in such a way that it need bow to no alien yardstick which mutilates everything that strives to shape itself in freedom. And I just think that's, Adorno is always incomprehensible, of course, but I think that's a very suggestive quote for the idea that there's a freedom that's always being stolen from you before you begin. It's always on the point of being taken away from you, but it's always potentially in excess of the powers that are trying to mutilate it. And I felt that you were doing something with that. And the second quote from Adorno, which I think is so relevant, is this one. In future, experimental music should not just confine itself to refusing to deal in the common coin. It should also be music whose end cannot be foreseen in the course of production. From this point of view, musique informelle would be the idea of something not fully imagined. So I felt you created, 1 minute, 4 minutes, okay. I felt you created a kind of anti-utopian utopia, because to end the piece where this will be for the Brotherhood of Nations, of course, is to fly in the face of the way in which those lines are canonized inside Israeli national consciousness. And if that could be true, then there really would be a kind of freedom that would be it would be a revolutionary moment. So I just want to end by saying, I've had a very extraordinary 24 hours, never mind the plane ride. I arrive here, and before I go to the concert last night, Mariam Saeed very kindly invites me to go and hear Marwan Bishara of Al Jazeera talking about his new book on the Arab Spring. And he was absolutely extraordinary. It was also here, which makes me think this is the place to be, right? But he was extraordinary because he was talking about the fact that, of course, let's be honest, in relationship to the Arab Spring, quite a lot has gone wrong, right? Quite a lot of the things that we hoped would happen have gone wrong. Not all of it, but some of it's gone wrong, and we do not know what the future will hold. And there was an incredible moment where he said there were a group of people, or rather, he put it like this, he said the people who were most surprised by the outbreak of the Arab Spring and the revolution were the people who were most disappointed by the way it's unfolded. And he said they were wrong to be surprised and they're wrong to be disappointed. And it reminded me of a brilliant moment in Freud where he says in relationship to World War I, the people who are suffering most from the disillusionment of the war are wrong to be disillusioned because their illusions were too high to begin with. and that therefore we need to just adjust the balance between expectation and hope. And if our expectations are too high, we will destroy the possibility of our own hope. He was talking about how revolutions, to quote Rosa Luxemburg, cannot be foreseen in advance, but disappear into the midst of the future. And he ended by saying that nothing will ever be the same again in Egypt and the surrounding countries, even though things could get worse. And I thought that was just such a brilliant expression. Nothing will ever be the same. We've reached the point of no return, even if things get worse. And I just thought something about that idea of freedom and revolution was something of what Mohammed was trying to do in his piece. Create a space for something utopian, but which would not rely on anything getting solved, or getting solved within the forms of political language that are dominant at the moment. So it was, of course, a plea for a new form of language. Thank you very much.
Michael.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm extremely honored to be a member of this group, and I feel even more unqualified than usual. I always feel unqualified. This is the other side of interdisciplinarity. So one always hopes that there's more courage involved in that kind of thing than simple incompetence. But I feel especially unqualified today, and I really am sincerely embarrassed about this because I was not there last night. I just absolutely could not be there last night. But I'm delighted that the error was made to include me on this panel in any case. I did have a look at the score and obviously at the materials, textual and musical, that make up this extraordinary work. So I have a very vague sense of what it involves materially and what it means both materially and analytically and spiritually. But I also think, and I will say, everything I say will really be in the form of a question because I'm so uncertain about it. It seems to me that there is continuity. There are patterns of aesthetic and critical and political continuity from this piece to other works of Mohammed's, and I was fortunate to receive a CD, and I was able to listen to a few of these amazing pieces, although I think the scale between those pieces and what was premiered last night is clearly quite different. But the piece I found myself listening to again and again in the last 2 weeks is the 10-minute piece for clarinet and orchestra called Tahrir, which I find absolutely extraordinary and just evocative of many of the things that Jacqueline was just referring to on the crossroads of a highly complicated musical and shall we say aesthetic cosmopolitan tradition, and also the political context and the context of the moment, the context of the event that one would associate with the work, obviously one carrying the name of Tahrir. This is a kind of dialogue, as you said, Jacqueline, between clarinet and orchestra, which, first of all, in terms of the history of the aesthetic, brings up the genre of the concerto that is very evocative of certain kinds of communication between individuals and groups. There are many places, many points of origin for this aesthetic. Probably the most obvious one is the incredible sequence of piano concerti that Mozart wrote in the 1780s. And one of the dominant ways of understanding this group of very consistent, very sophisticated piano concerti of Mozart has to do with the placement of the piano as the voice of the individual, the artist, the solo voice, and then the orchestra as some kind of collective. It's a very helpful way of listening. At times it's actually quite instructive. At times it's also very misleading in one of the ways that I would think, again in the form of a question, would be both evocative and misleading in the context of your piece, Mohammed, and that is that the positions that are given to these two entities as allegorized by individual and collective are a bit too fixed. They're a bit too fixed in terms of how these voices relate to each other, and they're also too fixed by, in fact, identifying some kind of position or identity before they start. So that we don't really know, it seems to me, and I think it's the case in Mozart, I think it's the case in your work, what these figures are before they start and what they become as they combine with each other. So there are these principles that I think are very key principles in the histories of these kinds of genres and the way instruments produce sound, and that is a kind of indeterminacy of voice, that who the voice is, who these voices are, the point that they start from, what happens when the voices mix, and whatever is achieved when a certain kind of formal maturity has been reached, some kind of formal resolution. There is an enormous degree of indeterminacy. At the same time that there is what one might call a kind of supplementarity of sound, that in a kind of musical experience, there seems to me to be a level of the supplement at the level of sound. I don't really want to say pure sound, because I don't think we're necessarily insisting on anything that's pure, but there's always something more there. There's always something more there than what you can hear, what you can place on the paper, and I think this is almost a kind of universal assertion in regard to a musical form. It's certainly the case with instrumental music. It's also the case with vocal music, whether it's a lone voice or whether it's a choral voice, which again brings up the problem of the collective. When one attaches a text to a moment of singing, an enormous complication comes up, because on the one hand the text is being sung, so a certain text which has language and meaning and all of the things we associate with language and text, all of that is there. On the other hand, there's a singer involved, and there's a certain kind of disjointedness. And what I'm saying now goes against everything one learns in a voice lesson, everything one learns in a coaching session, so I realize that, and I'm not invalidating any of that. Of course, what one learns in a vocal or coaching session is always to relate sound and text, right? There's always a kind of mutual communication. It's entirely valid. But there's also this problem of this supplement, that there is a kind of sound that's being produced by the voice, by the instrument, by the clarinet in the piece that I'm referring to, that is indeterminate, that in fact goes against any kind of meaning that is achieved through the work that is done by the text. And this to me is the most musical of these various levels of content, because music really can't say anything. This is one of the either pleasant or unpleasant, or maybe both, facts of music. Music really cannot speak. So that I would like to make the assertion, and I've been trying this out in print in recent years, that there is an almost universal melancholy to anything that is musical. Now, the category of the melancholy and of melancholia has received a lot of attention recently, and there's usually an assumption, which I think is valid, but it's not one that I'm making here at all, that the melancholy is very often pathological. I'm not really interested in that here, and almost always a function of some kind of loss, right? Either a real loss or a perceived loss, which certainly may be true. But it seems to me there's a certain very basic musical melancholy, in other words, a melancholy that is musically defined, that has to do with the gap between a desire to articulate, a desire to communicate, and the basic inability to communicate. So that music, in fact, may mean more, and may mean more things more specifically than language. This is Felix Mendelssohn's great comment, where he says in a famous letter, don't tell me that I mean less when I express things in music. The fact is that I mean more, and what I'm saying is more specific than anything you can say in language. It's a great counterintuitive comment that Mendelssohn makes in the 1840s. But the point is, it never gets there. In other words, any kind of controlled communicative meaning is always a function of desire and never a function of achievement. So there's an incapacity to a musical utterance that creates a kind of imbalance between what one desires to communicate and what one desires to achieve and what is actually achieved. So the more refinement there is, and I think this predicament encourages an enormous refinement in the control of the aesthetic. the more refinement there is, the more inarticulation there is, the more specificity there is, the more work there is, the more a musician or a conductor or a critic can produce extremely subtle differentiations, which are endlessly meaningful and sources of endless pleasure in trying to get things right. The more inside the discourse you are, the more you know that you're either getting it right or you're getting it wrong. It's very difficult to express that, and the more there is this grasp on what you're actually getting right, I think the more difficult it is to know what that is. You really, because there is an untranslatability, to go to the dominant metaphor of the afternoon. Now, again, in the historical tradition, I'm speaking, and I want to say something about this in a second, largely the European so-called classical tradition that modernizes from the 18th century, let's say from Mozart to Steinberg. There is something related to this that becomes an enormous privilege of the musical work and the musical culture, and that is this uncanny ability and, in a way, an uncanny privilege that music accrues through this period to become a certain kind of language of subjectivity, right? A language of the self, a language of interiority. That is entirely related to a certain kind of accrual of a subject over time, that is constantly moving, constantly attached to time, that has, I think, a fictional ability. I mean, a musical work is an object. A musical work is not a subject. But I think the great fiction of musical form in this period is the fiction of music as a subject, so that there is some kind of active subject that moves through a musical work as if the subject involved is actually working on itself and listening. So that when we listen to a piece of music, we have the sense that the music is somehow listening either to itself, to its past, where it comes from, to its desires for the future, always with this kind of inarticulation in mind, and is moving through time and actually doing the kind of work that we think subjects do. It's actually quite abstract, even when it gets attached to text, right? So operatic tradition is clearly the place to go for this, song literature as well. Even when it attaches itself to text, to plot, to character, to figures on stage, there is still this gap that opens up between this kind of abstract subjectivity developing over time that in musical terms can never be fixed, right? There can never be an identity position to this. And I would also suggest that there are very specific cultural coordinates for this importance, this kind of accrued importance in musical meaning and musical culture in, let's say, from 1750 to 1950 in the European context. And one of those, I just want to bring this up and not really develop it anyway, one of these contexts is an implied form of Protestantism. I'm not talking about any explicit religious context, but a certain kind of cultural position that is suspicious of the visual, suspicious of representation, and that is interested in a certain kind of abstraction. So the idea that the historical pattern in which, let's say, the music from Bach on has its origins in Protestant liturgy is by no means coincidental. To move to the Middle East, and this now is at the level of speculation, the idea that a certain kind of classical tradition comes to the Middle East through the transmission of largely Protestant cosmopolitan families in the Middle East, in Palestine and Lebanon, is also not coincidental. In other words, a kind of abstract, text-oriented, non-representational, non-visual, non-fixed position that is very involved with developments of subjectivity and interiority that are very much attached to this European tradition. Now, I've been in several conversations recently, most recently in Nazareth, on questions of musical education in Nazareth. And the question that comes up, it's a very important and a very predictable question, is whether we're still in a colonial framework when we're talking about the dialogue between the European musical tradition, and I think, Mohammed, you would agree that when we're talking about a symphony, we're immediately referencing this kind of musical tradition, and a cultural, political context where the relationship between the Middle Eastern reality and the history of a European form is problematic. So the question comes up immediately, are we repeating a certain kind of colonial relationship between this inherited legacy and the context in which, at the very least, one would want new aesthetic meaning to be produced, as well as certain kinds of transformative cultural and political results? And the hypothesis that is extremely dear to me and that I've been struggling with, is that if there's a good thing about a word that I really hate, which is globalization, and a word from the text of this afternoon, which is a lot better, and that's globality. Usually the alities are much better than the isations, I think. This is true for modernity, modernization. It's true for secularity, secularization. And I think it's true for globality, globalization. In any case, I always prefer the alities to the isations, for reasons one can get into that maybe is the perversity of my own ear or whatever. But anyway, globality is okay. But if there is a certain benefit to what we might call globality, it is not, right, Pace, Thomas Friedman, it has nothing to do with the flatness of the world, right? And it has nothing to do with a certain kind of universalization of culture. What it does have to do, if there's anything interesting going on, is a certain recalibration of legacy and communities of taste, right? Communities of interest that divide into highly specific networks, right? Highly specific bonds of communication. So what happens when communities, students, professional organizations in the Middle East form a kind of bond with this, as historical fact, European musical tradition? Something extraordinary, I think, can happen on the argument, let's call it the argument of globality, which is an argument of specific networks. Five. Always goes much faster when you're talking. This is really my question about the kind of aesthetic that we're seeing here. So I also did a little bit of reading I was on the train, not the plane, which is shorter and I think more comfortable. But I was reading a text that I'm in fact teaching next week, and that is Edward Said's Freud and the Non-European, which, as you may remember, also has a wonderful response at the end of what was a lecture given in London by Jacqueline Rose. And the point that both Edward Said and Jacqueline Rose make in this text has to do very explicitly with non-identity. What Said is doing is offering an extremely compelling reading of Moses and monotheism as a defining moment of Judaism that in fact rejects any kind of fixed identity, what in contemporary political theory would be described as sovereignty. There is no assertion of sovereignty over this mode of being that has come through history in terms that are called Jewish or Judaism, and which clearly include Freud in highly idiosyncratic ways. And the phrase that Jacqueline uses in the quoting Said in the afterword or in the comment is this phrase, fixity of identity, that there is no fixity of identity. And it seems to me that a musical texture, and the kind of musical texture that I was listening to in Tahrir, and I'm in a way only reading from the score and assuming also exists in the symphony, has to do with this very similar principle. That the kind of melancholy involved in the inability to articulate as connected with this always increasing desire to articulate is the kernel of the kind of aesthetic power of these musical forms, and I think also the political potential in these forms, that what is being produced is not the production of new identities or new fixed positions, but rather a kind of potential for dialogue that is in fact not a utopian potential because of the ongoing difficulty. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that this difficulty exists in the formal texture as well as in the political texture. So maybe I'll end there.
Thank you. I, of course, as well, I'm honored to be here in this with distinguished company. Some of what I wanted to say was preempted already, and that's good. I'm not equipped to speak and pontificate about music, but I'm assuming that I was invited to speak about the poetry and the dervish side of things. So my remarks will focus on the poetry and the text in particular in the work, and this stems from my own interest in the politics of poetry, especially in the works of national poets such as Darwish, and how they carry this burden of being a national poet, how they challenge or reproduce the grand political narratives, and how they succeed, and I think this is important in both the cases of Amichai and Darwish, in protecting their own work from the challenges and pressures of being placed in such categories that have immense symbolic capital. And both of them, I'm more familiar with Darwish's work, but both of them managed to do that because, of course, there are certain pressures and expectations when one is the national poet, yet both excel, and especially Darwish, I think, in deconstructing their own myth in a way and forcing larger collective and audience to change their taste and politics. And Darwish certainly does that with every collection, especially in the last 25 years. So and to use the word that Darwish likes, perplexity, I experienced a pleasant aesthetic perplexity from the work yesterday, the spectacular work, and it raised a number of very important questions about the potential effects and possible meanings that are produced when the texts of these particular poets are brought together and translocated into a new context and embedded in a larger narrative frame, which is the frame of the Jewish right. So one important question revolves around the political echoes and implications of this narrative itself and how it modulates the individual poetic voices and in turn the collective voices that they stand for, or the political narratives and national myths their works challenge and reinvent. I should say, of course, that I don't intend in any way for my attempted misreading, to use a Derridian term, to have a reductive effect on the complex and haunting work. But the political implications are unavoidable, especially in this context. So we have this extraordinary encounter between these three national poets, two of them Palestinian, Fadwa Tuqan, and I say Mahmoud Darwish and Yehuda Amichai. I say extraordinary because the three have never been brought together in a way in this specific mode to my knowledge. Darwish and Tuqan, being major Palestinian poets of different generations, had met frequently. And Darwish dedicated a famous poem to Tuqan and elegized her after her death because she is considered one of the major poets in the Arabic tradition, but specifically in Palestine. And important on many levels also because of her own biography, in a way, being born into a very important family, but quite conservative, and having certain events early on in her life forced her to stay home and being the sister of a major nationalist poet, Ibrahim Tuqan. But she, like Darwish and Amichai, managed to somehow write the nationalist poetry that was expected of her, but also forge a more personal, introspective type of poetry. So there was simultaneously a repetition of the national poetic discourse, but writing in a new way. Darwish, however, met and read with Amichai at a number of international venues, and there was this unique mutual respect and admiration between the two, despite obvious political differences. But of course, Tuqan and Amichai never met. So these are poets whose works have a complex and at times critical relationship to their respective national myths. And while they mourn the dead and question national and nationalist myths, they are also competing, if not fighting, for a discursive as well as an actual terrain on earth. So if they come together to mourn the dead and lament the futility of war, where do they go to after the mourning is over? They, or their ghosts in this case, they return to radically different realities. And that is something that I think we should discuss, and we'll return to this later. On many occasions, Darwish described the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as, quote, a struggle between two memories. So speaking in an interview, a famous interview with The Guardian in 2002, he described Amichai's poetry as a challenge to him, quote, because we write about the same place, he wants to use the landscape and history for his own benefit based on my destroyed identity. So we have a competition. Who is the owner of the language of this land? Who loves it more? And who writes it better? And I think we should at least think of a disequilibrium in a way between Amichai and the two Palestinian poets within this context itself. Darwish also described himself as a Trojan poet, and this is significant for the questions I want to raise. He saw himself as a Trojan poet because the grand narrative, when it comes to Israel and Palestine, was the one written by the Greek victors. So the master narrative of the victors, and the voices of the Trojans were lost. So he says, quote, I, as a poet, I'm in search of those voices. The weak should be able to bring their version of the story, and we must never settle for the version of the powerful. But obviously, a related challenge in attempting to rescue the voices of one's people and to reinscribe them into a historical narrative that privileges the victor already is how that victorious other is represented without being dehumanized. And that is, of course, the challenge. And we can discuss this later, and if we are comparing Amichai and Darwish. But I and many others would say that Darwish was really capable of this and presents a unique case in that not only does he humanize the Israeli other at a very early stage in his career, but he even humanizes the Israeli soldiers. There is a very famous poem called A Soldier Who Dreams of White Lilies that was written right after and during the 1967 war, and it's dedicated to Israeli historian Shlomo Sanz. And this is another example of the really difficult choices that Darwish took, which not all national poets, I think, can do, because many national poets, and even in the Palestinian context, someone like Samih al-Qasim or others were, in a way, content with having that audience and never really tried to challenge the status quo politically and culturally. And I want to read a section from that poem, which is a conversation between the poetic persona and an Israeli soldier who is going to, obviously, to war, to kill other Palestinians. So, back in '67, that is very significant, I think. So you're leaving. What about the homeland? He said, leave me alone. I am dreaming of white lilies, of a song-filled street, a house that's well lit. I want a good heart, not the weight of a gun's magazine. I want a day and its sunlight, and no fascist victory exaltation in it. I want a smiling child in this day, not an issue of the war machine. I came here because I thought a sun was approaching its zenith, not setting. I refused to die, turning my gun, my love, on women and children, to guard the orchards and wells of oil tycoons and tycoons of weapons factories. He said goodbye to me because he was looking for white lilies, for a bird taking the morning to its heart among olive branches, because he understood only the things he could smell, the things beneath his hands, understanding, as he told me, that home is sipping his mother's coffee and coming back safely at evening. And now in many of Darwish's early and especially middle and late poems, there's an astounding conversation with the enemy in so many forms. And that is really exceptional, which does not happen on the other side. Actually, one problem with much of Israeli literature is that the Palestinian or the Arab is, if he or she appears, are either somehow lacking, either mute or absent, or so there is not an attempt at full humanization. And even beyond Mahmoud Darwish, actually, Ghassan Kanafani, the great Palestinian novelist, in his very early work as well, was the first to acknowledge the presence of the other, and not only that, but the historical trauma, and that the Israeli other has this traumatic history of the Holocaust, which complicates the conflict. So, just a second, I'm sorry, where I'm trying to find that. Okay. So, now here, unlike the master narrative, in this work, the voices of the Palestinians are present, but Palestine itself is absent as a signifier. Yet Israel, of course, is present in the prayers, and it is biblical Israel. But this, in a way, poses a problem, in a way, or at least poses the question for me, is that there are the problems of the monotheistic narrative. Could there have been Canaanites in this constellation of poems and prayers, for example? Because in the search, or knowing that the biblical memory and biblical mythology is itself used in nationalist mythology and in Zionism, and in the denial of the presence of Palestinians in the Zionist discourse, Darwish and others were at pains to then, invent their own past, and here where the figure of the Canaanite becomes really important. So what of the poet's own deaths also? Amichai, who fled Nazi Germany as a child because of anti-Semitism and settled in Israel and fought in the Israeli wars, died in 2000 and was buried in Israel, the homeland he chose and called home. Tuqan died in 2003 during the second Intifada in Nablus, while her hometown was under siege. And the other excerpt that Muhammad used from the longer poem by Darwish was also written when State of Siege as well. So to go back to this disequilibrium, Darwish became a refugee at age 6 when he had to flee his village with his family, Al-Birwi, which was one of 400 villages that were destroyed during the war that Amichai fought in. And he had to live and die in exile, far away from his home in Galilee. And his visits to Israel he could not visit his family or his home except with a military permit. So he was denied a return to his homeland. And this issue of return, of course, whether in the poetry itself or in the larger conflict, is a central issue that has to be addressed. And I want to read one final section because being hopelessly biased when it comes to Darwish, he got less space than Amichai last night, so I have to add something. But this is important in terms of the complex task that Darwish had to face, which is to construct a homeland in words, because the homeland was lost, but then to realize that there is the danger of ultranationalism. So in a way, in his later works, he beautifully dismantles the very same myth that he created at a time when it was important. But in narrating in his last prose book, In the Presence of Absence, which dovetails with this theme in a way, because he, knowing that he might die or will die in a few years, he wrote his own elegy and imagined that the living Darwish was elegizing the dead Darwish. But there are incidents that are very important about his life, but especially the childhood, and the incident of what the Nakba, what the catastrophe meant. It's a very short piece. In one ill-fated hour, history entered like a bold thief through a door as the present flew out through a window. With a massacre or two, the country's name, our country, became another. Reality became an idea, and history became memory. The myth invades, and the invasion attributes everything to the will of the Lord, who promised and did not renege on his promise. They wrote their narrative. We have returned. They wrote our narrative. They have returned to the desert. They put us on trial. Why were you born here? We said, why was Adam born in paradise? Remember yourself before all turns to dust, so that you may grow up. Remember your 10 toes and forget the shoe. Remember the features of your face, forget the winter fog. Remember your mother and your name and forget the letters of the alphabet. Remember your country and forget the sky. Remember. I'll stop here, 15 minutes.
Thank you, 15 minutes indeed. I must say that this panel has been, for me, a very wonderful experience, because I threw out a few questions in the beginning. I'll turn to Mohammed. And in fact, you have related to those questions. I'm not going to speak right now because I think other folks should question and Mohammed should speak and so on. But if there is a moment at the end of the proceedings, I will collect my responses. But one thing I will say to you, Sinan, you see, I believe, and I hope I was right, that you were really bringing up the question of the iterability of a ritual, of a rite. What is your grandfather's picture hanging in the museum? What is it? So that particular thing, I'm very happy that you did bring it up. And there are other points that I've made notes, but I'm not going to go into them right now. Right now, I'm going to ask Mohammed to speak to us, to join in, as Rose said, to join in a conversation with us and the audience. So, Mohammed, join.
Joining.
Very good.
There are many responses. A lot of ground has been covered in the comments from the panelists, and there are many issues that have been opened up that are not going to be resolved today, nor were they resolved in the Third Symphony itself. I'll start with Freud and the non-European. As you know, someone who was lucky enough at a very tender age to witness Jacqueline Rose's formidable and beautifully constructed response to Edward Said's thoughts on Moses and monotheism in London, at the Freud Museum in London. It strikes me as a very interesting parallel. The reason why we delivered this work at Columbia yesterday, and why we're here today, has much to do with a lot of the same reasons as to why Edward Said did not deliver Freud and the non-European at the Freud Museum in Vienna. I won't get into that too much, but you can read about this. Another thing that was brought up in the interrelationship of music and text was the biggest challenge in the construction of poems and prayers. The open-ended end of Yehuda Amichai's Memorial Day for the War Dead going into the epilogue reprise of the Osei Shalom with the added Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel of the Kaddish. I took my cue knowing full well that this would not be a resolution. I tried to make it as convincing as possible. As a naive artist, I think you might find this effort cute, but maybe even more so, you might find it touching. Going from there to another of Edward Said's great essays, From Silence to Sound and Back Again, we need to recall his recollection of the end of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and the end of the Missa Solemnis, one of Beethoven's late works. He says that the amazing prolongation of the C major chord at the end of the Beethoven 5 is a way for Beethoven to, and again the huge coda to the Missa Solemnis is a way to resist silence, because silence means death, and to insist on the primacy of sound. And of course, predictably, we get from there to Schoenberg, and then from Schoenberg to Cage, and then back. Well, at the end of the symphony, the addition to the Jewish rite of the Kaddish, of the Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, is stated dramatically by the insistent repetition of the chorus. The chorus repeats this 11 times. Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel. And the harmony changes and it reaches its tonic key, its home harmony. And the soloists say V'emru Amen, and the chorus responds with Amen. I'm not even going to pretend that that's a resolution, but it's exactly what Adorno was, Said, channeling Adorno in From Silence to Sound and Back Again, was hinting at, was explicating in the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven. I don't think it makes the Missa Solemnis, I should say, I don't think it makes Poems and Prayers a less powerful or effective work in not reaching a conclusion. And I know it doesn't make the Missa Solemnis a less powerful work for the same reasons. I worked with a number of comparative models in composing the symphony, some of them having to do with obvious models like the Benjamin Britten War Requiem, and others having to do with Beethoven's late style, and the Ninth Symphony being another work where the D major, which is also the key of this symphony, is prolonged almost endlessly at the end of the symphony, because Schiller's message in the Ode to Joy of Alle Menschen werden Brüder is Beethoven really wants to make this a convincing statement, and so you get a lot of D major, and it's not out of a lack of I was aware of this. I'll also add another secret because you guys showed up today, okay? So you get secrets. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony begins with the open fifths of the D and the A. And for those of you who are musicians, the third degree of that chord is what decides whether it's major or minor. If you have an F sharp, it's major, and if you have an F natural, it's minor. The finale of the Third Symphony begins in the same way. It's open fifths, and then David sings an F natural, Yom Zikaron, and then at the end of the piece we're transformed finally into D major. So it's at once a sort of touching thing, and a lot has been said. I mean, I admire what you said a great deal, but a lot has been said about the amount of airspace I gave in the piece to the Israeli poets versus the Palestinian poets. And there was also a very specific reason for the choice of the poetry in question, which you hit upon, the State of Siege. both the Darwish and the Tukan were written in the context of state of siege, and the Amichai was written during wartime as well. They're all wartime poems. So that's a little bit of information about the piece. Just a few tidbits. Maybe I'm just ranting about it, really, because I don't have one specific thing to respond to. But yeah, I'll stop there. It's just like the symphony.
I must say that thank you, Mohammed, and now the questioning begins, that there were some things that Michael said that didn't really relate to giving space to more to the Israeli poems. And I hope that we will come back to those, because you really spoke to me. When I was saying trace, I was meaning that business of that melancholy of there is language here, but not really signs, that melancholy of meaning. That was a wonderful thing, but we don't have to discuss it. But and finally, one thing and then questions. You know what is the best one, though? It's neither ization nor iti. It's izability, Benjamin. I've just written a book, right? And Lindsay Waters told me that I wouldn't sell the book if I called it Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalizability. And so I've written that in the last sentence for the reader. If you've read up to here, know that the title of this book is. And Samuel Weber has written a fantastic book about Benjamin's abilities. So I propose to you that that binary opposition is not to worry about. It's the ability, and that's what we're really talking about. No more babbling. Questions? Stathis.
Do I stand up? Do I need to?
Yes, Mike?
Yeah, I will need to. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for being here and for giving us your wisdom, and thank you, Mohammed, for this extraordinary and very inspired piece yesterday. I found all three presentations remarkably evocative, and but Gayatri has correctly warned us not to stand up here and make the grand exhortations. So, but I do want to speak about something that I find that pertains to all three. My tendency is to do that anyway, it seems to me that if I can, I will do this very telegraphically. Jacqueline, you spoke about a certain disjointment. Correctly, right? And Michael, you spoke, not quite about the disarticulation, but you raised an issue about articulation. Sinan, you spoke about disequilibrium. So I find this a kind of almost like the leitmotif of the panel, if I put it in those terms, which is contrasted in my mind with the word symphony, which is the word itself is the coming together of voices. And I would like, because Michael did raise the issue also of symphony as a form within a very specific historical context, but that I don't want to go just there. And maybe this is more directed to Mohammed, but it's really something that everyone can participate in. In what sense that we can speak about a symphony coming together out of these various disjointments, disarticulations, disequilibria, and whether that would be in some ways a kind of almost ironic coming together of this form, the symphony, with this particular material, right? And which may in fact lead also to your comments about the lack of resolution from another angle. So
do you want to take 3 questions, or would you rather answer this question? I don't care. It's up to you. I mean, I normally take 3 questions, but then I'm the speaker. But I'm not the speaker here. So what would you like? Would you like to answer? Or are there 2 more questions on the floor that you would like to hear? Nobody seems to have their hands up. Go ahead. Is there? Okay. Come on.
I want to address the issue of the body in pain and how one represents that. Elaine Scarry wrote the book, The Body in Pain, and she also has a section in which she talks about faith and the modulation of making. So within this religio context of biblical text, Old and New Testament and other scriptures. I'm wondering, this question is for Mohammed and also for Michael, who was addressing the notion of melancholy, which Bernstein talks about in the Unanswered Questions in his attempt to link Chomsky and musical language, in which he talks about the universal cry. But within this framework of soul and body and the religio, I'm wondering, Mohammed, whether you were struggling with the differences between the geist of a soul of a Old Testament narrative versus what Michael was talking about, a New Testament narrative, into the differences of body and ethnography and how one represents that in suffering.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there anything else? There's one, yes.
First of all, I want to thank everyone at Columbia. I'm out from Kansas City. We're hoping to do a similar program a year from now. So, and I have a question. Really, it goes to the language, the use of language that I think Mr. Steinberg spoke of. In Mohammed's piano sonata, he simply displays text of Miss Rose along with it. There's no vocalization at all. But the text and then the piano, and you can actually, if you're in the audience, see people move, fidget in their chair because they get uncomfortable with the way the music is portraying the language and the text. And as I was sitting there last evening, it seemed to me, Mohammed, that you were doing a similar thing with the text yesterday. The text wasn't used for the beauty of the text, but rather to convey some other kind of message that was going on that was apart from the words. And I don't see your work last night, or other work really, as being more focused on the beauty of the music, but rather carrying the message, or a message, more generally. And I'd like you to comment on that and the place of the language in the music. But it seemed to me, and one thing, a final thing I would say, and one of the things that I really admire what's going on in Columbia is when Mohammed did the concert out in Lawrence in the Kansas City area, most of the best comments were from people not involved in music. They were from law professors, they were from sociologists, there were people who drove up there in trucks to hear it. You know, it wasn't from those people trained in music. And I think that is actually certainly where I'm heading, and I think that's where Mohammed's heading as well.
So now the floor is yours. You decide how you're going to answer these questions.
Well, I think there are interesting common denominators among these three questions, starting with the symphony. There is this paradox in the symphony of, on the one hand, the polyphonic or the symphonic, and on the other hand, the kinds of gaps that open up between coming together and creating gaps, and between what can be expressed or articulated and what can't be. So the moment of scandal in the history of the symphony is exactly the moment that Mohammed mentions, also in terms of inspiring the formal relations in your own work, and that is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And it really is the generative moment of scandal, right, where he adds words, and you're just not supposed to do that. So that nobody is, in terms of some kind of rational history of the form, nobody's ever known what to make of that work. It generates everything that comes after that, but it remains the unbelievable exception. And it's a work that is, I would almost say, a kind of unperformable, unhearable work. It really is a big problem. Because once you get that movement, it first of all very clearly undoes everything that has come before. Talk about the future anterior, right? And if one knows the work, one knows that everything one is listening to in the first three movements will be undone, at least in a declarative way, by the fourth movement. And then it achieves a certain kind of spiral and scale where, if you're really going with it, I mean, for me, the great recording is the Furtwängler recording because it completely falls apart. I mean, he may be the greatest conductor of all time, but he winds up making the Berlin Philharmonic sound like a high school band because he drives it. He drives it to the point where, and he knows what he's doing. He's not an incompetent man. It opens up so that it explodes, is what happens. I mean, the work, and that in a way is accurate to what is happening there. It cannot contain what it's trying to do.
You know, to control the future anterior, to make the trace into a sign, I mean, that is human life, as it were. Right. Isn't it? I'm sorry, carry on.
No, that's right. And I mean, I think there's an important issue there involving language and body, right? Language and pain, and Scary's argument about the gap between one and the other, right? The gap, which is the medical gap, the physiological gap, and then the political gap when she talks about torture, right? In the body and pain, so that one can treat pain, but one can never understand somebody else's pain. In other words, this is being contested now in people who work on this kind of thing. And it has to do with these questions of radical translatability and untranslatability. And that goes back to the great Benjamin anecdote where the untranslatable and the translatable are the same, right? The famous story about the mistranslation.
The translator made a mistake.
Right, where the translator from German into French, right, one of the early Benjaminians in Paris made a mistake translating the task of the translator, where he translated the Benjamin sentence about the infinitely translatable intuitively into the infinitely untranslatable, and then Paul de Man came along and said they're both the same. And you know, as unpleasant as it is to admit that de Man was right, of course he was, because the untranslatable and the translatable are in fact the same, as long as you emphasize these gaps that open up rather than any kind of overlay, right? Any kind of equivalence between one version and the other. So I mean, this is what the aesthetic is about, right? The aesthetic, meaning sensation, is about physical sensation, and the emotion that comes from understanding something through an aesthetic form does begin with the body, I think, in producing the form as well as in receiving it.
Who else wants to pick up one of the questions? And then Jacqueline.
I just want to riff on one of the things you brought up, because another comparative point of generation for the Third Symphony is in studying 40 or 50 recordings of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I found that Furtwängler had a wonderful approach. He got some things right. In his 1942 recording of the symphony, Beethoven has this wonderful crescendo. The people who have sung the symphony or sung the solo parts will know this. Beethoven actually has the strings playing louder than the chorus, and then he has a wonderful crescendo in the chorus on the words "Alle Menschen werden Brüder," and the strings are playing these D major arpeggios. No one does that. Everyone has the chorus come in fortissimo. There is only one recording that really gets the crescendo into the Alle Menschen werden Brüder. It's the 1942 Furtwängler recording, which he did, where he was performing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony at Hitler's birthday. And he gets the lines, Alle Menschen werden Brüder, right, all men will be brothers. So there's an irony in that, just sort of riffing on what you were saying, that was an early sort of generative spec in the creation of this symphony for me. The other thing that I mentioned just in addressing the question of the symphony, it's going back to the roots of the symphony as something that sounds together, is that I have a tendency to want to avoid the, I mean, I know that it has, the form itself has a certain colonial tinge to it, but not if you go back far enough. And of course not if you follow the progression of the sounding together and the pit stops that it makes in the Middle East, and then comes back toward the West. The idea of the idea of these cultures as isolated monolithic entities that have no interaction is, I don't think, very convincing to me. So the idea of the symphony as a Western thing, or is a little outdated. You know, the idea of me in my present form for very superficial reasons not being able to be a composer is preposterous. Or the idea of, you know, I mean, just simplifying things to a very basic level. So that's what I would say in reaction to that. And Jacqueline, do you want to, you haven't heard The Last Resistance, you haven't heard it.
But I will be hearing it this week.
Yes, at Brown.
Yeah. No, I haven't. And so I was fascinated by what you were saying. And I'm sure I'll be the most uncomfortable person in the audience of the bunch, by the way. I thought the three questions were fascinating because I agree with Michael that in some strange way they're related. The question of coming together out of disjointedness, and the question of faith versus the modulation of making, and the tension between beauty and the message. And it just made me think that there's a real problem here in a way, which I think Sinan relates to. I think what you were doing was in fact very different. I want to open up a bit of tension in the panel. I think what you were doing was very different and very challenging for some of the ways in which we've been talking about this. Because what I heard you say was that there is a question of return. And there is a question of disparity of historical narratives. And there is a question of justice. And it is not compromised, you did not use that word, but it is certainly strained by a piece of music which tries to put these different voices into some kind of dialogue with each other. And I was thinking, I mean, if I've misrepresented you, forgive me. And I found myself at one point getting very heated when you were speaking because I thought Amichai is not a national poet. You know, let me, please come in. He's not a national poet. He is the melancholic poet of a kind of national idiom with which verbally, and you're absolutely right, he fought in all the wars, nearly all but one, verbally he cannot identify. So when he writes, for example, Jerusalem 67, he enters the city and he's screaming, right? He's screaming. And he writes about, there's an incredible passage where he says that everything is too illuminated and the writing is on the wall. This is 67. This is the moment when, you know, people were saying they saw the Messiah at the head of the tanks entering Jerusalem. People said they actually saw the Messiah. And so for him to do this is so counterintuitive in terms of the dominant national narrative. He says the writing is on the wall, so he is identifying Israel with the traitors of the Jews in Babylon, with Nebuchadnezzar. It's the most shocking thing to have done. So I would just want to say that Amichai does to the sort of national imaginary something of what you say Darwish ends up doing by way of a deconstruction of himself, although it's very different. However, I also agree with you about the disparity. Sorry, one other thing I want to take issue with. It is Shlomo Sanz, the soldier, apparently, right? Mm-hmm. In the Soldier Dreams of White Tulips, it actually was Shlomo Sanz, which, for those of you who know the invention of the Jewish people, it's absolutely staggering to think of these two together. But I really would love to know what you think about this, but I don't think this is about going to war. I think this is a post-67 poem. That's it. I think it's a soldier who is talking about the awfulness of what he has done and how it's destroying him. It's a very controversial poem. I was so glad you mentioned it, and I'd love to talk about it. But anyway, before I get locked into this discussion, I feel we're talking about the tension between justice and dialogue, and I'm thinking of an earlier conversation I had with Mohammed about one of Edward's essays on humanitarian criticism. Do you remember? Humanism and democratic criticism. And we were talking about, surprise, surprise, the term resistance. So I went back and read the essay, and Said is using it in two very different ways. He's using it, on the one hand, to mean the resistance of the text to its interpretability. The melancholy, in a way that Michael was talking about, the fact that there's always a supplement and something that escapes, and there's something bestial on the floor about it, he describes, which means it resists a kind of interpretive hubris. But the other meaning it has for resistance is that it is the task of music and culture to resist the depredations of the everyday, i.e. to resist injustice, to put it very simply. And I remember in there was a wonderful memorial conference for Edward, at which Akhil Belgrami, who's here, right, not here now physically, but who's here, gave a paper in which he said there was a real tension between these two aspects of Edward Said's work, between the demand for justice, let's call it the right of return, the refusal of symmetry, and the need to put people into dialogue with each other because there is suffering and injustice for everybody. And I don't think you can reconcile them, and I certainly don't think you can weigh them up against each other. And as you were talking, Sinan, I was thinking, it's a question of counting. How much counting should we be doing, in a way? And that's, of course, a musical question as well as a political question. And, of course, we have to count. We have to count, and we have to name the dead. But what happens when you start trying to weigh up the forms of suffering, which I also think somewhere else politically has to be done? It's also completely and utterly impossible. So I was fascinated when Gayatri just came and said, you have to control the future anterior and make the world into a sign. I thought it was amazing the speed with which you came into that, because, of course, for psychoanalysis, for Jacques Lacan, the future anterior is the space of analytic time, and I'd want to say is the space of analytic practice as well, which is not the past of what I once was, which would be repression or denial, nor the past in what I still am, which would be repetition. It's what I will have been for what I am in the process of becoming. What I
Can
will
I just
have been.
interrupt you for a moment? I did not say you have to control. I said to want to control, so that some of us even want
But
to
you
do
can't help
different
wanting
life.
to. But you can't help wanting to.
Well,
right?
that's fine. But
Okay.
on the other hand, you can also keep on into a labyrinth of wanting, not wanting, who
Okay,
wins,
fine.
loses, and so on. But
Okay,
carry
so
on.
I think that's what I'm talking about. And I'm just, you said it, Gayatri, but you can't help but not want, you can't help but want to and not want to. So I'm fascinated that there is a kind of, I mean, I loved it when you said, I'm going to read a bit of Darwish because the Palestinian poets, or no, Darwish didn't get as much as Amichai. So then you really are counting, and I know, Mohammed, you've got into trouble because, I mean, you didn't spell it out. It would have been nice if you know, maybe you don't want to spell it out, but they didn't like, the people who commissioned this piece thought there was too much of Turkwan and Darwish. You know, there was too much of them. What is the too much and not enough in this context? And what does it mean to ask for dialogue when there's still an issue of injustice that has not yet been solved, as there flagrantly is in relationship to this political conflict? And I really don't know the answer to that.
I think we have time for a few more questions, unless unless you want to answer to this answer also, Sinan?
Well, I was going to say just something very brief. I think there's a difference between the degree to which Darwish and Amichai are willing to excavate the identity. I mean, Darwish does that more in his poetry, and even in the interview, saying that I recognize that now the other is part of me, and in his poetry extensively using biblical and Jewish symbols. But Amichai, at the end of the day, is a Zionist. He's a left Zionist. And the issue of return comes back because, to me, it is the measure of the future. Darwish believes and worked for a one-state solution, but Amichai, he is leftist in the Zionist Israeli perspective, but does not go far enough, as far as I think, and as far as many others think. And it's not about counting, because, I mean, it's interesting. I was actually thinking about because who commissioned and how, if they had, what kind of parameters had they suggested. But it's not about a full poem, and in a way, this could be read in a problematic way, is that here are excerpts and fragments from the Palestinians who appear, but then you get the full poem by the Israeli poet, not to simplify it. But also in a lot of Amichai's poetry, it's this typical Zionist discourse of the landscape, and a lot of them, the Arab is this part of the landscape.
What about the Arab shop in Jerusalem, where he stands in front of his shop and says, my father had a shop like this, but it's his shop, and he makes the light of the ark shines on he actually makes holy the shop, and he walks away, and he makes the shutting, in the Hebrew, the shutting of the gate, which is the end of the most important prayer in the Jewish liturgy, and him shutting his he makes an absolute mingling of forms in his use of language. And this is 67, when they're meant to be saying, this is mine now, sorry. And he doesn't. He says, this is not mine. This was my father's, but it's yours. So I think to call him a straight Zionist is going too far.
Leftist side.
Yeah, I
Yes,
think
there's a difference.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, let's
But I
keep
think
the
he's more
difference
interesting
alive.
than
Because I don't think the two of you will agree. You can decide what
The
to think
siblings
as you
will not
read.
agree.
But let me also say one thing here before. I think we'll have about 5 more minutes to close up with questions. I won't go into all the stuff that I wrote, but I will say this, that, you know, when we teach, for example, we do not teach to reproduce ourselves. And I took very much your point that the ones who responded were not the ones who were into music. That was a strong thing to say. So those were the questions with which I had begun. That, you know, yes, who intends the work? And who is the implied listener? And to that extent, I was very moved by the piece. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Mohammed, and I want this conversation between us to continue. But I must ask the question, within what right is, I mean, and this is for the non-musical person, I don't care how much the musical person, I mean, the person educated in music can say that it's open, etc. But it's meant not only for those who can read that way. As a teacher, I'm completely convinced of this. And if so, within what give and take of say and say, within what right do I place this? I think it's a very important question, and I'm not going to just simply let it go because the intention of the composer was to keep the resolution open, because that's really something that we have to think through very carefully. I have the same kind of problem with architecture discussions, you know, the intention of the architect for the building to mean this, but that's not what the building is there for. So it's not just composers and so on. There is a problem here, whereas when we read, we keep on thinking that reading cannot be justified this way. So that question, the question of the iterability of a right, which takes the most pregnant moment of the endorsement of something to place within it, it's not a question of whom do you give more time to. It's a question of what to the receiver of the piece seems to be the structure to which you say yes as a listener, because that's what one does. One learns to say yes to the structure as a listener, not as someone who is into the educated as a specialist. I do want to say this. Now, do we have until 5 o'clock? That was the question. We have until 5? Oh, 5:30, 3 hours? Okay, so then we can have many more questions. I don't think we should go until 5:30, no. But I think we can have some more questions. Yes.
It's been an interesting week for me because I've spent a lot of time over at Manhattan School where Kurt Masur and young musicians are wrestling with the meaning of Beethoven. So then to come here today, it's quite a juxtaposition. My question is actually last night, hearing the symphony for the first time, what I came away with was not the coming together of a symphony, but what really stuck in my head was the isolation of certain instruments. Two celli at one point, the harp, the flute. I wonder, Mohammed, if you could speak to that, because that for me was an unusual characterization in a symphony to have those particular solitary instruments come out.
I can't give away all my secrets, but it's been stated that the Israeli poem is presented as a whole poem. It's been stated that both Palestinian poems were presented as fragments. It's been stated that both Palestinian poems were selected as poems that were written by the poets while under siege. And it also is the case that in both the movements of the iteration of the Palestinian poetry, they are accompanied by isolated instruments in the darwish, the solo clarinet, and in the Turkan, the solo violin, while the Israeli poem is presented with full chorus, soloists, the entire orchestra. So, those are all the facts. Now put it together. It should, at this point, I've been undressed to the point where it should be fairly obvious. But if it wasn't in the performance. But yes, this is, to answer your question, it's intentional. If you wanted me to speak to it, I can recount reading about your first visit to Israel, where you didn't feel that you were returning, where you didn't feel that the land was yours, and where past the discussion of land pornography and all the juicy things that you find in states of fantasy. Read it if you haven't, but you come to a point where Palestine is a fragmented entity, and Israel in the political reality is not. So in some sense, am I representing things within a Teutonic form as they are? I think that perhaps I am. In another sense, do I feel undefined? Do I think that Edward Said's description of us as unicorns was accurate? Maybe. But there is the representation of dispossession in the piece, and it just does not need to be as obvious as, it does not need to be tremendously obvious to those who cannot put it together on their own from listening to the piece. So we've put it together today, and you've put it together. I haven't put it together for you. I've affirmed your questions. Well, we're suspicious of this in your work. I've affirmed your suspicions. So, there it is.
This, I know David is here too. When you have a work like this that is so emotional, what changes are you looking for in the musicians from the time you start preparation of the piece till last evening?
That's an excellent question. I guess that's a question for me, right?
Yes.
All right. Do you want to ask a question? Ask your question now.
I have learned an incredible amount this afternoon. I mean, this is actually a marvelously productive, provocative, interesting, unexpected conversation. And we can do that because we learned a lot last night, I think. But to hear you speak just now, Mohammed, seems to be an element returning to the discussions that a lot of us want to keep aside, which is the question of the representational ambition of the music, independently of the question of supplement, of trace aspiring to be sign. And I wonder if we might all think a little bit about that more generally. If, as you've just narrated, there is some ambition to represent or to make visible the fact of fragmentation, and to represent that as having occurred within a structure dominated by right as law. If we are supposed to hear that last tonic note and the lure of resolution, which keeps coming back in that piece, the temptations to feel ourselves in moments of resolution, reconciliation, and some other forms of respite, it seems to me, are constantly offered to us as perhaps descriptions of our moment or the narration of the political now from the position of the dominant. Then I think that the challenge of the piece is that it makes visible that narrative of the dominant now, reproduces it for us in some ways, but also in the manner of the Trojan, maybe, is hiding in the piece other incitements to a different kind of recognition / listening. I mean, the moment of last night, that which is a moment that calls up or resonates with other moments, in particular in David Krakauer's clarinet solo, where that last expiration, when the instrument becomes mere breath, and the whole question of the musical, the relationship between language and sound, is called forth as a problem, and momentarily there is silence in that huge symphonic, otherwise often resolving piece. I mean, I think what becomes visible is that this is the demands for the audience are enormous. And I'd love to hear what other of the panelists think about this, the double work of, on the one hand, representation, which might appear to be without irony in moments, but which is constantly via the work of the soloists and the moments of dissonance, the breakdown into silence, the breath undone. And it's hard for us, I think, all to listen in a context where we're all seeking to embrace the lure of resolution, to become attuned to what you've named in other pieces as satire, as irony, and so forth. And it's not named in this piece, Poems and Prayers, and we're all within the structure of the right. And this is perhaps a force mitigating against the recognition of the irony or the Trojan element or what have you. I'm just curious whether this is a description that resonates for others on the panel, or is a useful way of thinking that tension, not simply as a kind of question of the political elements within the piece in terms of the asymmetries, the real geopolitical asymmetries, and the disequilibriums between the specific voice, the polyphonic element, and so forth.
Well, since we took two. Is there another one?
I think,
There.
yeah.
Come on.
Sorry. Thank you so much. It was an honor to hear you speak about this, and it was very insightful. I'm not a musician, but I am a poet, and I'm trying to write out of a place of mourning, but also about mourning, and in using multiple languages. And I'm interested in how you negotiate the pull towards silence and the idea of silence when speaking about mourning and loss and death. And I'm also interested in that space in which language not only is unable to communicate, but also alienates. And how different languages, when presented, dismiss and sort of do not recognize all audiences. So if you could speak a bit about silence and multiple languages. Thanks.
Well, to answer the first question about the preparation of the musicians, there's a great deal involved. I think it was unfortunate that Yunje, who is our conductor, was not here for Gayatri's invocation of the meaning of the conductor and the meaning of the conductor in his case, leaning both backwards and forwards. But there are immense demands made of the audience, and there are immense demands made of the musicians. And this is characteristic of my work. Steve Sondheim said, art isn't easy. That can be interpreted in a number of different ways. Might be the understatement of the 20th century. But moving forward, Roz, your question I want to answer in true Middle Eastern style with a question. What are the movements that reach resolution in the symphony? Think about that for a moment. Does the Darwish reach a resolution? No, it doesn't. It's an exhalation.
It puts into play the lure.
But the only cadences in the piece are at the end of the ancient texts. Yeah. The modern texts, Darwish and Tukan, do not reach resolution, and neither does the Amichai. There is no end to the setting of the Amichai. It goes into the epilogue directly, and both the Darwish and the Tukan reach an exhalation, one with the solo clarinet, second with the solo violin. And that harkens back to what Michael Steinberg was talking about in the role of the soloist in the concertos versus the orchestra. The traditional role of the soloist, or the sort of chamber music entity, versus the masses or the collective representation. So this is all at play in the piece. But to what extent it's perceived, I think depends on how closely one listens, pays attention. So yes, incredible demands are made, on the audience, and I don't think, not in the traditional modernist musical way of writing difficult music. No, this is what Adorno had preempted in the Versen Musik informell, in the towards an informal music, which is collected in the Quasi una Fantasia selection of essays, and what you might have seen in this piece, and what I'm trying to develop in my work in general, is in direct opposition to several currents in contemporary music now. I remember Edward Said's reaction to The Ghost of Versailles, John Corigliano's piece, when it was done at the Metropolitan Opera. This piece, and we can leave the discussion of ghosts in this symphony and the discussion of ghosts in an opera that I project in the future for another panel, but it channels Beaumarchais, and you have the image of the ghosts and so on and so forth. I think the Manhattan School of Music is doing it. Right.
Reduced version.
Yeah, the reduced version. As being the ultimate affirmation, as that opera really is. It's a horrific affirmation of the imperialist agenda. I'm trying to stand in firm opposition to that in the best ways that I know how, and that is by creating a synthesized, dialectically informed composition that, by necessity of what it is challenging. And there are several details that come up that warrant the piece to be performed repeatedly and that will emerge in repeated performance. I hope that I'm starting to achieve this, but I'm not done yet.
Well, I'll ask the others to approach this, but if I could just comment on this, I'm really trying to listen very carefully to what you're saying, Mohammed, because I think it's important that we hear you, not just as we heard you last night, but as you're speaking now. There are two different modes. I made this comment also when you were at Columbia before talking to Jacqueline, and I think both are important. But I really also do want to echo your warning. Music does not mean. And it doesn't not mean in the same way as poetry was supposed at a certain point not to mean but be. We are not going into that nonsense. But this is something that we have to look at as a kind of agon, and you must speak as you do, and you must speak as you do. It's a kind of thing together. I'm sorry, carry on. You want to respond to all of these?
I think the question of silence and the relation of silence to sound and music, especially at the end of a piece or at a certain moment of resolution, but not resolution in a large sense, resolution in a small sense of a different point having been arrived at from that can be understood. There's some interesting differences of understanding. Daniel Barenboim has written, very nicely about this, and that's one point of view, and that is that if you take a kind of musical energy as some kind of physiological analogy, right, so that there's some kind of life force in music, or some kind of breathing, or a kind of parallel to a kind of arc of life, then what happens at the end of the piece is death. Right? So that if music is life, then music is over, and if there's a kind of parallel with mortality, then the silence at the end of the piece is death, and it's a obviously very sensitive moment. So that he writes, for example, that one thing a conductor will do is to preserve the memory of sound for a few minutes, so that the audience can feel the silence as some kind of absence of what has just happened before. That you don't want an audience to have a reflexive, there's a moment of applause, or let's get up and leave when the thing is over. But I don't think that's the only way to understand this kind of achievement of silence, because there's also an idea of silence as a kind of peace, right? So there's almost a kind of aesthetics of silence. That the silence is the absence of music, but there's also something perfect about silence. So that one reaches something at the end of a piece, and I don't want to draw any kind of parallels between, well, I'm not exactly sure about this, but I don't want to make anything too easy about peace in the political sense and peace in the kind of physical sensation. I think those are two different things. But there is a sense of silence as peace and a kind of stability and solitude, which can be very frightening. I think people avoid silence. It's a very scary thing to be sitting in silence. But I think what happens at the end of an important performance, both with regard to the music and with regard to some kind of community of listening that happens when a large number of people are actually sharing a listening experience, is that there's a certain kind of peace that is achieved, right, both through the experience of the work and through the experience of each other, which requires an actual performance. I mean, it requires a live performance, and it requires an audience that is very different from the death idea. Right, it's a certain kind of hovering of a life moment, which dissipates, but is ultimately very musical. I think. I'm not sure that makes sense, but it's a very musical moment, even though there's no music there.
Yes. Do you want to respond to these at all? Okay. So, are there more questions? I will wait for more questions, but I will put in my little 2 bits once again. I mean, that's the way I'm moving. There are 2 things. One is, and this is going to astonish you, but I wrote this a long time ago. It's not just written in response to what's just happening. See, one of the things that I think, and I will say 2 things, right? I think it's very important to be able to want to get into, I've said this in India many, many times, to get into the one who comes to take us over and imagine him, or sometimes her, as human. This is why Asya Jabbar and I so hit it off because, when she begins her that series, she wants to enter into, and not as a critic, she wants to enter into the French captain who's coming toward Algiers on the boat, and wants to imagine what it is like to be a human being coming towards this place that he's going to take over, this unknown place. And she once told me, no one's going to like what I'm doing with Carthage right now, Gayatri, because I really like Polybius. See, so, this kind of thing I very much believe in. That's not something where there's a double bind in that, because she also feels that, that this is why people like Lukács despised Rabindranath Tagore's huge best novel called Gora, Whitey, because there was this kind of desire to understand what I call the resident alien, the person who's become a resident, not just a green card holder, but he's a citizen now. So to an extent, as I was talking about it, it's a double bind situation. You don't have to justify yourself, but it becomes noticeable, and that's where I said you enter the space of education. Okay, now that's the first thing. Here comes the second thing, which is a kind of whammy against this. Okay. Right. So, but I mean both very seriously. At least I think so. This is my stereotype of myself. But I am a complete unbeliever in every possible way, shape, or form. A polytheist brought up like this can't even be an atheist, because that's accommodated within Hinduism. You could become a Karmakandi Hindu. The Hindu who doesn't believe, just does the whatchamacallit. Okay? So, old, horrible, heteropractic, non-Abrahamic religion. This is a very different kind of thing, but it's still going strong. This is the color of the other side. That's why I wore it. This is the color of the Hindu nationalists who kill Muslims. See, I never wear it, but I thought, wow, what the hell, I see
It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
No, it's not a lot of fun. It was a gesture toward, what I just described with Asya. You know what I mean? Okay. But one of the things that if one thinks about religion, religious formation, as something like a language learnt in the blood, lingual memory and all that stuff, at a certain point, Derrida, in his monolingualism of the other, says that it was, he went into this messianicity without messianism, etc., because he was born as he was. It's a very humble moment that, sorry, perhaps I couldn't avoid this because this is how. So I'm saying something of that sort. We don't pray. This is a very peculiar thing. There is no prayer. Of course, after 19th century Semitized Hinduism, I can produce a prayer or two for you. But in terms of the heteropraxy, there is no prayer. There's praise, but there's no prayer. So from that point of view, the fact that I'm coming over again and again and talking not about, I certainly got the point that the wonderful musical the stuff and the Palestinian stuff, that it was showing something over against that Israeli stuff. It's not just Israel and Palestine. That's the one that's one. I mean the New Testament and the Old Testament. That's the big one that's recognized all over the world, yeah? So that's okay. But within that context, you see, for those who are within a tradition that does not pray, it looks, and we also exist, you've written for everyone, you go all over the place, although you haven't really been to Asia proper yet, only West Asia. So the scene for a prayer becomes much more strong to us as listeners than it just so happens. And so that was my question, not about, even as I very much sympathize with wanting to look into and through the eyes of Polybius, as it were. At the same time, that was really my question. The iterability of the right did not belong with saying, oh, you gave the Palestinians too little and the Israelis too much. Right. See, that's what I was talking about, that what sanctions? See, but there can be other questions, obviously, but since nobody was asking a question, I just wanted to put this in.
Well, it also is connected to the concept of meaning within the music itself and the connectivity between the text and the music as it exists within the musical composition. The advantage that we have, Michael, as musicians is that because we have the luxury of being able to say that music is perfectly meaningless, we are also engaged in the most subversive art form. It can have a very immediate meaning that we do not explain, and that is inexplicable even when connected to text, and that remains inexplicable. Otherwise, this discussion of music being meaningful or not wouldn't still be going on. But it also enables us to do things like what we did last night, which is actually very, very subversive, to reach people in ways in which they create a certain meaning. And that meaning can actually be completely disconnected from the music and the text itself.
Yeah, this conversation is becoming more and more fascinating and complex and difficult, I think. But if I've understood what you're saying there is a crucial moment of identification with the resident alien, or the one who's coming to take you over, which is about as risky as you can get, because it's humanizing the one who has put themselves outside the bounds of a certain possible human identification. But I thought what you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is then a risk, if you do that you have reiterated prayer on the page, that you've created something which then becomes a form of potential religious identification. I'm not sure that's quite what you were saying, but I thought it related to Rosalind's point, because I thought you summed up very clearly the problem, one of the problems that's been going on in this discussion, which is for all the discussion of silence and supplement and excess and meaninglessness, I thought you were saying that what Mohammed had done in his piece was to say, this dispossession can be represented. That's it, this fragmentation, there is a form that could correspond to it, even if it's giving with one hand and taking away from the other. So I just wonder if there isn't a real problem here about, and it partly doesn't answer your critique, but it partly responds to your critique, that if you want something which cannot be reappropriated by the false forms of mastery, but you don't want to slide into prayer in its oppressive sense, how do you give form to dispossession and fragmentation? I mean, how do you navigate between these things? And I sort of, it's not because I want to produce a false conclusion, because I also don't want to be the person who ends, but it's as if that question is what your piece of music is about, in a way, if there's an about it at all. But it's sort of really, I mean, the fact that we could have this conversation makes me think it really is productive for thinking about that question of the limits of representability in an age of political injustice, to put it very crudely. And I don't know, Rosalind, if that's sort of what you were talking about, but it felt as if you were a bit.
I don't think I was trying to, in any ways distill for Mohammed an ambition, and I would be perhaps suspicious anyways if we allowed ourselves to accept simply your intentions as the description of the work, and that would be across the board. But awful. It seemed to me, I wouldn't quite say as a I think it seemed to me that one way to respond to this piece as a putting into play or a staging of the desire for music to take on that representational work, in which case, yes, exactly, the risks of putting out a right as the framing structure when one tends to read right as law instead of a principle of iterability, when that law is in a particular status in the real geopolitical frame of our moment, and so forth. And I think that if that was your ambition, and you wrote a long text, and so I believe that it is part of your ambition to put that into play, then the other part of the ambition is also to make visible in some complicated way the fault lines, the breakages, in the very complex sense of the term, resistances, that are given voice in the particular, in the text, in the Palestinian text, but also in the solo work and in the music itself. It was a question as to whether that is indeed one of the ambitions.
You talk about the text. Are you talking about program?
Poems. I'm talking about the poem. I just mentioned that in your program you give us a strong statement.
I could very easily, and perhaps I should make this my practice, I could write a contrasting program note, or 5, for every single piece. And I probably will over the course of my years, you know? I'm 26. By the time I'm 46, that piece will have 7 different program notes, many of which will contradict one another. And then other people, on top of that, people like Michael and others, will write their own programs for this. And it'll be so confusing. And one will turn the other on its head, you see? And that's the problematic of what we do as musicians. That even though when we link it to a text, that can be completely irrelevant. In the maybe irrelevant is too strong a word, but it can be completely meaningless.
It won't be to generate dissertations, you know, when there is this kind of confusion, because that's what happens. But also it's the question of identifying, humanizing. That's really not what I was talking about, because the way in which the imagination abstracts is not humanizing. No, I mean, then you have to think of a certain kind of literary production, characterological, etc. No, it's not like that, first of all. And second of all, I don't believe we were saying that music is perfectly meaningless. We were to an extent saying that it is the melancholy ground of a reaching toward meaning. And on the other hand, one also knows that a sign system is perhaps more impoverished because it systematically can offer up something like meaning. Were you not thinking of that? Thinking of it in that way?
Yeah.
So it's not is not, but cannot and must want to. So it's a field of wanting of a certain kind. I'm sorry, carry on.
I would also, again, I'm speaking from real empirical ignorance, since I didn't hear the piece last night, and so everything has to be bracketed. But I would resist the claims of representation. Although I can't defend my position for the reason I've just said. In other words, but I would resist the claim of representation, but just in order so that the claims of engaging reality, right, in a context of overrepresentation, right, in the general context of a kind of unreliable overrepresentation of the same realities. I'm saying this in response to this defense of this almost but not quite of musical understanding.
Can I just say one thing? I'm not saying that it is representation. I was trying to say that one of the lures of a piece of this is that it puts into play a certain desire for that music to do representation.
And if one gives into that desire, then one sees a structure in which we have, a particular state form, the dominance of ritual, misconstrued as law, and then one has other kinds of things happening within it to break that apart, to undo it. If one gives into that, I was not saying that it is representation, that it should be. I completely support and sign on to 100%. The analysis of the relationship between language and music is one of supplementarity, absolutely. But nonetheless, we are here having this conversation precisely because what has been put into play is a desire for this work to do something in the order of representation, which we all, I think, rightly resist.
No, we don't. Not completely.
And yet indulge.
That's where I began, about what does it do, space of education. And remember, yes, I'll come to you, but remember about ritual. It wasn't the dominance of ritual. I was talking about what was holding it. Because remember, ritual is the existential temporality of the sacred is very different. So that the ritual is supposed to be that which is infinitely repeatable as the same. And its power, especially the most powerful Abrahamic ritual in the world, you cannot just, I mean, I recognize it, but you wouldn't recognize the other one. I mean, you're a Southeast Asia specialist, you would recognize certain kinds of things, but that's because you're a specialist. So the thing is that in that context, iterability is exactly what is not infinitely repeatable as the same. So that's the question that I was asking. When you take it on like this, it's not just about Israel and Palestine, because the world is so large that to an extent you have to take that damn thing which is infinitely representable as the same in many, talk about translation, in many languages of the world, that you have to take it on as a bigger challenge if you're into iteration and social justice and so on, is all I was saying. I wasn't saying that I want to see ritual or it's too dominant or anything. I was saying that it was holding the piece in order for the listener to be able to say yes and have this discussion. Das ist alles. Yes, the last question.
I want to continue Jacqueline's comments about the limits of representation within a colonial structure and to try to shift it into post-colonialism. In other words, whether music is the thing in itself or the object or, it's expressionism. The question is, I guess what I'm trying to allude to is the problem of musical training. I started at the Juilliard in the pre-college, in which in ear training, you analyze the Bach chorales. If we were going to be post-colonial, what would we do differently? In other words, are we doing world music or are we doing Western? And then how can we achieve this otherness in which Jacqueline's saying, within this hegemonic system in which the Chinese are coming to the conservatories, they're being trained in a colonial way, and is that necessarily good? And how are we going to get something other if everyone's coming over here, pardon my Yiddish, they're all schlepping over here and being trained in this Western colonial way, and then what's left?
No, everyone has questions.
I just have a short question. Given what we've spoken about already, could each panelist talk about what they would do 6 months from now if this piece was going to be presented in their community, how they would talk about it to their community, not just the academic community, but the place in which they live?
I live here, so this is my community. Yes.
My last question would be very much like this gentleman's question. The piano sonata, which pairs the text of Miss Rose, has been performed not only at University of Michigan, University of Indiana, University of Kansas, but also at the Central Conservatory in Beijing, in Jakarta, in Korea.
Some 20 times it's been performed.
Oh, it's probably closer to 40 at this point, all over the world. I think that when it's presented in that fashion, I think there's a definite representational and a point of view being presented. I'm not arguing with it, but I think when that's presented at the Central Conservatory in Beijing or in Korea or in Jakarta, they're getting a particular point of view.
Yeah.
Well, this will be the end.
Yeah, this will be the end. We're not living in a post-colonial world in music. That's the simple way of answering your question. We're not yet there. We're not even close. And I'm sorry you went to Juilliard.
Well, shall we end on that note? Thank you very much. And really, this has been for me a very fantastic experience. And I hope there will be many panels of this sort, and I hope you will come back.
Oh, I wanted to end on a positive note.
Okay, good. End away.
We'll get there, but not, we have to just, first of all, drop the words, drop ethnomusicology and drop world music. I just hate those terms so much.
I'm with you. And I don't even want to get to post-coloniality. Let that be the last word. Okay, so thank you for coming.